The standard story about why Europe does not produce enough giant technology companies is that Europe lacks talent, or Europe lacks risk appetite, or Europe lacks simply ambition. The story is wrong. Europe has 3.5 million tech workers. Europe has hundreds of unicorns that have already produced thousands of second-generation founders. What Europe lacks is something more specific and more fixable. This is part 4 of the European scale-up question. This is about the difference between having talent and having recycled talent. Hello and welcome everybody. This is episode 769 of Startuprad.io, recorded solo by me, Joe Manager from Frankfurt am Main, Germany. This is part 4 of the European scale-up question, Startuprad.io's continuing research franchise on why Europe produces so much innovation and so few globally scaled technology giants. If you have been following the series, you already know the early installments. The first flagship piece established a diagnosis. Europe creates startups, but comparatively few become global leaders. Then we walked through fragmentation, Europe's hidden growth tax, and how legal tax and regulatory splits turn European expansion into repeated market entry rather than continental scaling. Then the capital architecture work on where financing becomes discontinuous between growth stages. Then demand without deployment on how European institutions and corporations are slow to produce and deploy European innovation, how strategic customers themselves are a form of scale-up financing. Together, those 4 pieces trace the structural, financial, market and operational sides of the gap. Today's installment adds the last of the core mechanisms, the human one, because none of the other pieces of the system work if the ecosystem cannot turn one generation of scale-ups into the operators, founders, angels, board members, and networks that build the next generation. That is what this episode is about. Not a talent shortage, a recycling problem. For everybody thinking about, what is that? Think about the PayPal mafia. Over the next roughly half hour, I'm going to walk you through what the data actually says about the European tech talent, which is not what the consensus story claims. I'm going to introduce you to a concept we're calling experience density, which is Startuprad.io's framing for what the scale-up bottleneck actually is. Then I'm going to walk you through the founder factory data that shows the recycling mechanism is real and measurable, the operator pool data that shows how deep Europe's senior bench actually is, the German employee ownership reform that has been genuinely fixing parts of this, and the remaining gaps, including something we call the escalator effect, which is the specific way European scale-up experience can leak abroad when a company gets acquired. Then, at the end, what actually helps. Let's go. The mistake in the usual story. Start with what the data actually says about European tech talent. Atomico's State of European Tech, for example, estimates that European tech workforce reaches roughly 3.5 million people in 2024. That is about a 7-fold increase over the previous decade. 7-fold in 10 years. This is not the shape of a talent shortage story. If Europe were losing a headcount race with the United States, we would expect flat or declining headcount, mass immigration of engineers, or an inability to fill roles at the growing companies that do exist. None of those match the data. Europe is producing engineers, researchers, and founders at rates that would have looked implausible in 2015. So when you hear the consensus explaining for the scale-up gap, not enough talent, not enough ambition, not enough risk appetite, the raw headcount version of that explanation is factually wrong. The constraint is a different kind of talent, not people who can write software, not people who can start companies, people who have already scaled a company through the phases where most European startups actually stall. Internationalizing sales past your home market, inserting a layer of middle management as headcount goes from 50 to 500, surviving the specific boards and governance dynamics of a Series C or Series D round. That knowledge is not taught academically. It is not sitting in a textbook. It is largely accumulated through direct exposure to high growth environments, through actually doing it at scale with a real company. You cannot mint that knowledge at, for example, in university. You cannot hire your way around a market that has too little of it. So the right question about European scale-up talent is not how many engineers Europe produces. It is how much scaling experience Europe has managed to accumulate, and critically, whether this experience recycles back into the ecosystem or actually leaks out of it. Experience density. Call the resource experience density. This is a Startuprad.io framing, not a single published metric, but it's grounded in the evidence we are about to walk you through. Experience density is the concentration within an ecosystem of operators who have managed the 50 to 500 plus employee growth phase of a technology company. A city can have thousands of engineers and still lack the handful of people who know how to build a revenue operations function, run a multi-market launch, manage a board through a down round, or restructure a go-to-market motion when the first one hits its ceiling. That handful of people is what a scaling company actually competes for, not junior engineering headcount, not general managers imported from unrelated industries, specifically the people who have already done the thing the scaling company is trying to do. If you are a European scale-up trying to hire your first VP of revenue, your first international general manager, your first head of customer success at scale, you are not competing for talent that is scarce in general. You're competing for talent that is scarce in your city, in your language, in your regulatory environment, and in your investor network. Experience density. The point of the concept is that it explains why headcount statistics can look great while scaling continues to be hard. Raw talent grows linearly with time. Experience densities grows non-linearly. It grows through the actual creation and scaling of companies, and it grows fastest in places where past scale-ups have concentrated their alumni. That is the framing. Now the evidence for how it is created. The recycling mechanism. The academic mechanism that explains how experience density gets created is called entrepreneurial spawning. A landmark 2003 NBER working paper published in the Journal of Finance in 2005. Paul Gompers, Josh Lerner, and David Scharfstein showed that venture-backed firms and public firms in entrepreneurial regions act as a source of new ventures. They call these firms training grounds, places where future founders learn to raise capital, build executive teams, and run high-growth operations. The mechanism is not mysterious. People who watch a scaling company succeed learn what success actually looks like. People who help build one learn how to build one. Then they leave and try themselves. 10 years later, in 2013, researchers at Maastricht University published follow-on work in small business economics using a Dutch cohort from 1999 to 2004. They found something important. Ventures spawned from well-performing firms tended to perform better financially themselves. The knowledge that transfers from a successful scale-up is not just how to run a company. It's specifically how to run a company that works. There is quality inheritance. The implication is direct and it changes how you should think about scale-up policy. Successful scale-ups are not just companies. They're institutions that train the next generation of founders and operators. If the ecosystem lets that experience recycle locally. The word to emphasize here is locally, because if the experience recycles, but it recycles in a different city, a different country, the original ecosystem does not compound. Founder factories. Now, here is what makes this a live European story rather than a theoretical one. The recycling is now measurable. It is happening and the data is public. Dealroom and Accel run an ongoing series called Founder Factories. Their 2026 update maps how alumni of European and Israeli scale-ups go on to start companies. The headline number: over 400 European and Israeli unicorns have produced more than 2,300 startups founded by their alumni. 2,300, that's impressive. That's not a projection, that's a count. Germany specifically punches above its weight in Dealroom and Accel's 2025 ranking of founder factories. 3 Berlin companies placed in Europe's top 10. Zalando alumni founded 56 venture-backed startups. Delivery Hero alumni 43 and N26 alumni 34. 3 companies, 1 city. 133 second-generation startups. And the effect is local. In Dealroom and Accel's 2022 analysis, 56% of companies created by former unicorn employees were founded in the same city where the alumni gained their experience. Berlin specifically showed roughly 70% local retention. So when scale-up alumni start their next thing, more than half of them start in the city where they earned the experience. Experience, once created, tends to stay where it was earned. That is why concentration compounds. Berlin is more Berlin next year because of what Berlin was this year. That is a very different picture from Europe lacks talent. That is a picture of specific European cities becoming denser and denser with people who know how to scale. The operator pool. How deep is Europe's operator bench? Atomico data again. As of 2024, more than 12,000 tech professionals in Europe held senior leadership experience at billion-dollar-plus technology companies. That is the pool of people who have been VP, C-level, or senior director inside a company that made it. Almost 1/3 of them worked for US tech giants at some point. Think Google, Meta, Amazon, Salesforce, and the equivalents. So Europe is not just producing its own senior operator, it is also importing back operators who trained in the US ecosystem. 12,000 plus senior tech leaders across Europe. Meaningful, growing, and real. But, and this is Startup.io's interpretation, not a directly measured claim, that pool is unevenly distributed. It is not evenly spread across all European cities and all technology sectors. The founder factory clustering data supports the direction. Senior operators concentration follows scale-up concentration. Berlin has more experience density than Frankfurt. Paris has more than Marseille. Stockholm has more than most of Southern Europe combined, which means that when we talk about Europe's scaling capacity, we should not talk about its number for the whole continent. It is a function of specific city that have concentrated experience and cities that simply do not have. Germany's management context. And now a note on Germany specifically, because Germany is the largest economy in this conversation, and the pattern here is often misread. Germany's industrial and Mittelstands management is genuinely world-class. Any honest analysis of European industry has to concede that, but, and this is the key distinction, Germany's industrial management is optimized for a different problem than venture scale hypergrowth. Industrial management excels at process optimization, risk minimization, quality control, long production runs, and stability across decades. Venture hypergrowth demands something different. execution under acute instability, tolerance for iteration, comfort operating without proven templates, and rapid course correction. These are not the same skill sets. This is a difference, not a deficiency, but it means that when a German deep tech company hits the scaling phase, it cannot simply hire experienced industrial manager into scale-up executive roles and expect the same performance. The two disciplines are distinct, and deep tech scaling needs the second one, which the region has historically had less of. This is a quality assessment. I'm offering it as a commentary, not as a measured superiority, but it is directly relevant to why don't more German deep tech companies scale globally. It is a real question, even in a country full of excellent managers. Germany's policy turn. The German government has structurally recognized this and has been trying to fix parts of it. The federal government's 2022 scale-up strategy named talent and employee ownership among its top 10 action fields. That was not a vague strategy document. It named specific mechanisms that were broken and needed policy intervention. In our interview with Startuprad.io with Anna Christmann, at the time digital commissioner, she argued that the position that employees should face tax on their equity only when there is an actual liquidity event, not on paper gains before any money has changed hands. That dry income taxation, as it is called, has been one of the specific things making European employee ownership less valuable than US employee ownership. Christmann was direct about what needs to change. I want to keep that on record. Christmann said it on Startup Radio in 2023 before the reform actually shipped. What happened next is the interesting part. Employee ownership and the ESOP gap. Now, here is the mechanism getting concrete. And here the wording has to be precise because this is one of the most misreported statistics in European tech. The historical issue was not that European employees owned less of their companies than US employees. The historical issue was the size of employee options pools. Index Ventures, called Rewarding Talent Research from 2018, found this pattern. US ESOP-pools, the employee stock option pools that companies set aside at each founding round, typically expanded roughly 20 to 25% by the late stage, meaning by Series D. European pools have historically been half that, driven largely by punitive tax treatment, driven by the very dry income problem Christmann was talking about. If issuing option creates a taxable event for your employees before they can actually sell anything, you issue fewer options. That gap has been closing. The not optional campaign, Index Ventures and a coalition of European investors, estimates late-stage European employee ownership rose from about 12% to about 16%, moving an estimated 5 billion euros in value toward employees. That is a campaign estimate, not an official statistic, but it's directional and it is meaningful. And in Germany specifically, the Zukunftsfinanzierungsgesetz, the Future Financing Act, took effect in January 2024. It deferred taxation of employee stock options to actual liquidity events, so employees no longer face tax on paper gains they cannot yet sell. It raised the tax-exempt threshold under not optionals methodology that brought the German employee stock option regime much closer to US comparable level. Not identical, but close enough to remove the specific structural bottleneck. Why does this matter for a recycling story? Because option value that actually reaches employees is what funds the next cohort of European angel investors and next cohort of European founders. If your employees never realize the value of their equity, the flywheel does not turn. If they do realize it, some percentage of them become angels and some smaller percentage of them start companies themselves. The ESOP reform is not primarily about worker compensation. It is about capital recycling. If your firm is a fund, a scale-up or corporate strategy team that needs to be visible in European scale-up policy conversation, you can become a partner at Startuprad.io, link down here in the show notes. The 2026 strategy. Germany has since gone further. In July 2026, the federal government published its startup and scale-up strategy spanning more than 150 measures across the full company lifecycle, from formation through growth through internationalization expansion. It is not just a startup strategy, it is explicitly a startup and scale-up strategy, which in itself is a policy signal about where the government now understands the bottleneck to be. On the infrastructure side, our primary Startuprad.io interview with State Secretary Thomas Jassombeck details the DE Hub network and Startup Factories program. These are talent and spin-off engines. They are designed to increase the rates at which universities and research institutions produce spin-off companies and to create scale-up support in specific locations rather than diffusing it thinly across every German city. Now here is Startup Radio's honest assessment. Startup factories can increase the rate of venture formation. Yes, they can absolutely produce more startups. What they cannot instantly create is experienced scale-up operators, because experienced scale-up operators are, by definition, people who have already scaled companies. Makes sense, right? You have to actually have the scale-ups before you can produce alumni. Policy creates the pipeline. Time and successful scale-ups actually happening creates the operators. That is not criticism of the strategy. It is a note about what to expect from it and when. The escalator effect. Now the harder part of the story. Creating experience density is not enough if it leaks. Cross-border mergers and acquisitions are part of a healthy startup ecosystem. Founders, employees deserve liquidity. Investors deserve returns. Acquiring companies deserve access to European technology and European teams. There's nothing wrong with cross-border M&A as such. This is the specific problem is what happens after. When a European scale-up gets acquired by a US company and the R&D stays in Europe, but headquarters and strategic decisions making moves abroad, the local ecosystem loses something very specific. It loses the training ground for the most senior executive functions. The global capital allocation function, the legal and the IPO function, the C-suite strategic decision-making function. I think of this possible mechanism as an escalator effect. When the top of the organization escalators lift out of Europe and moves to US headquarters, the European office ends up training mid-tier operators and specialized functional leaders rather than complete C-suite decision makers. So the R&D talent stays. The junior operator talent stays. But the top of the operator pyramid, the people who would otherwise have gone to run the next generation of scale-ups as CEOs or to sit on the board or to lead their global expansion, that group increasingly gets into formative senior experiences outside of Europe. I want to be careful about how I position that. The escalator effect is a Startup Radio analytical lens. It is not a documented continent-wide statistical pattern. What it rests on is the European Investment Bank 2024 Scale-Up Gap research, which shows how financing constraints push European scale-ups toward relocation, foreign listing, and foreign acquirers, draining what the EIB calls the local flywheel. That documented phenomenon is real. The escalator effect framing is my attempt to name a specific mechanism inside it. Take it as a lens for thinking, not a measured fact. Secondary liquidity. There is a lever that works before the IPO, before the ecosystem needs to wait for a full exit or even to start recycling. Mid-stage employees, tender offers, and secondary market transactions let operators and early employees realize part of their equity personally without forcing the company to premature exit. Revolut's 2024 employee secondary share sale is a concentrated European example. Employees who had been at the company for years were able to sell some of their options and turn paper wealth into actual money without Revolut having to IPO or sell. The careful claim about what this does for the ecosystem. Secondary liquidity can shorten the time before employees are able to recycle capital back into the ecosystem, for example, as angels and as founders. Instead of waiting 6 to 8 years for an IPO, an employee who did a secondary sale in year 5 can start writing angels checks in year 6. That is meaningful. The stricter claim, the secondary liquidity has been proven to accelerate ecosystem recycling continent-wide. It is not something the current evidence directly supports. The mechanism exists. It is spreading. It is a good thing for the operators who use it. But the causal effect on ecosystem-wide recycling is still to be measured. I'm naming that as a direction bet, not as a data point. Startuprad.io is where the European founders, VCs, corporate strategists and policy institutions show up when they want to understand the European scale-up conversation as it actually is, evidence first, even-handed and specific. Partner with us to reach that audience with your firm story. What actually helps pulling the mechanism together? This is Startup Radio's synthesis of the evidence above. 4 recommendations. 1. Treat scale-ups as training institutions. When a European scale-up succeeds, the ecosystem does not just get one successful company, it gets a training institution for future founders and operators. Policy should be designed to keep the alumni of successful scale-ups in region and the capital in region, because both of those inputs feed the compounding effect. 2. Finish the employee ownership reform job across Europe. Germany's Future Financing Act was a good step. Not optional, identifies 7 European countries that now match or beat US stock option policy. That means the majority of European countries still does not. Finishing the pan-European alignment of employee stock option regimes through something like a EU ESOP or 28th regime for European equity is one of the most direct policy levers available to increase the rate of capital recycling. When more employees realize value from their options, more of them become angels and founders, and it's a compounding effect. 3. Support secondary liquidity mechanisms, not because they will single-handedly solve the recycling problem, but because they materially shorten the time between when an employee gains scaling experience and when that employee is in a position to fund the next generation. Framework that supports secondary tender offers both at company level and at investor level is a small structural intervention with a plausibly large downstream effect. 4. Address the escalator effect retention leak. This is the hardest one because it points back at the early installments of the series. Retention of C-suite strategic functions in Europe requires late-stage capital, public market depth, deep enough that European scale-ups do not need to relocate to raise growth capital or to go public. That is the EIB's core prescription. Building the financial market infrastructure that lets European scale-ups scale without moving their headquarters. It is the connective tissue between this episode and every other episode in the series. The scale-up question verdict. Let me close. Europe's scale-up gap is often narrated as a failure of nerve. Europeans, the story goes, are too cautious, too regulated, too risk-averse, too build the great technology companies of the 21st century. That is not what the data says. The data says Europe has built the raw inputs. 3.5 million tech workers, 12,000 plus senior operators, 400 plus unicorns already producing 2,300 alumni-founded startups. The raw inputs are there. The startups are there. The successful scale-ups are there in growing numbers. What the data also says is that Europe is still learning to recycle, to turn each successful scale up into the training ground and the capital source for the next generation. Some parts of that recycling mechanism are built. Again, some parts of this recycling machinery are being built. The Zukunftsfinanzierungsgesetz worked. The 2026 startup and scale-up strategy is comprehensive. Secondary liquidity is spreading. Founder factories are compounding in specific European cities. Other parts are still broken. The escalator effect leaks the top of the operator pyramid. Most European countries have not finished ESOP reform, and the late-stage capital infrastructure that would prevent forced relocations is still under construction across the continent. The scale-up gap is not a talent shortage. It's a recycling gap. Fix the recycling and the density compounds on its own. That was part 4 of the European scale-up question. If you found this useful, please rate and review Startuprad.io wherever you're listening or watching this. The companion blog post with the full evidence table, the citation-ready statistics, the founder factory data, and the ESOP reform timeline, and the complete source list is at Startuprad.io. The full series is worth reading as a corpus. The central pillar is called the European Scale-Up Question. The 3 prior installments are fragmentation, Europe's hidden growth tax, the European scale-up gaps, why startups don't become tech giants, and demand without deployment. Together with this episode, they trace the structural, financial, market, and human sides of the connected question. Part 5 is coming. Subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you find your audio. This has been Joe Manager for Startuprad.io. See you soon.